Hey everybody, it's Christina from Creations with Christina and welcome back to my channel. We are starting a new video series here for the holidays called Homemade for the Holidays, and it's going to be a series of videos on paper crafting, card making, gift ideas, as well as home decor items. So all of these things are all going to be handmade, and I'm going to walk you through on how to make all of these items. We're going to start off today with making cards. I have a set of cards. I'm going to do 2 different sets of cards. Today is just the first set. So we're going to be using this stamp set by My Favorite Things called Dashing Deer, as well as the coordinating dies. And then I'm also going to be using this Christmas Noel paper pad by Tim Holtz. So really sweet and cute colors in here. We're gonna start off by doing all of our stamping. I'm kind of doing this assembly line style. I'm going to be using my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. So I cut up some Bristol cardstock that I just cut up into different sizes, big enough to stamp out this little deer that I have on my block here that's from the stamp set. And we're gonna stamp, I need 6 of these. I'm gonna stamp a couple of extra because I'm known to mess up coloring, mess up die cutting, and mess up stamping. So we're just going to go ahead and do a bunch of these and stamp these out with some black ink, and I'm just using the VersaMark Onyx black ink, and we're just stamping this out onto our Bristol cardstock. You can even do this quickly with a stamp press if you have a Misty stamp press or the Tim Holtz or any of the ones that are on the market. Those would be great too. It makes it pretty easy, but since I don't really need to make sure these are straight, since I'm going to be die cutting, I'm just stamping them out onto my scrap cardstock here. I decided to cut these cardstocks and the cardstock down instead of just doing it into one big sheet of paper, because this may or may not be the second time that I've done this video, because I tried to stamp these and color these all into one piece and it ended up smearing everything. So my advice would be to cut these into smaller pieces and stamp them out so that you can color each one, especially if you're using water. Because I just wasn't giving things time to dry and then getting my hands stuck into the images. So I have 2, 4, 6, 7. Let me just do one more just to be safe here. All right, so there we go. So I have these all stamped out. I'm going to use a couple different markers. This first one is in the color Oatmeal. This is the color I'm using to do some of my lightest parts, like the little chest area of our reindeer, as well as his face and his ears. I'm not going to do any blending with water with this because this is a pretty simple coloring. So I'm just going to go through and do this like assembly line style and color in all of these. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and colored all of the little reindeer faces and its chest, and now I'm going to move on to the darker color. I'm going to be using a medium brown, or mid brown it's called, and for this I'm going to color in my whole reindeer, and I'm not going to be too careful about making sure everything's blended in nice, because this I am going to come back with a water brush pen and blend and color it in, because I want to give my reindeer some texture. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this one. So that's our first one. I'm gonna set this one aside. I'm gonna go ahead and color in all of my other ones, and then I'll come back and show you what I'm gonna do with the scarf and the hat. So I have my reindeer all colored in. The last thing I need to do is just work on the scarf and the hat. I wanted a darker color red, but I don't have that in the clean color markers. So I'm just using a carmine red and brown to make my darker color. So I'm just gonna lay down a little bit of the red on the hat. I'll also add it to the scarf. Being careful not to get the color all over the place, because this is the one color that if you're gonna smear it or smudge it, this is where you're gonna make your mistake. That's why I always like to cut out extra, because that's gonna be when I'm gonna do it. So for the hat, I'm just gonna keep this really simple. I'm just gonna actually add the brown right to the hat, because I'm not gonna do any blending. It's a small area, so it's not really worth blending. But I'm gonna take the brown and just do a little swipe of color underneath the deer's neck, and then also coming down from the scarf. And then I'm gonna go back with the red, the first red we used, and blend that out. And that helps me get that little bit of a darker color red that I wanted. So one little trick I want to show you is when you do anything with water, especially for me personally, I find that I go out of the lines quite a bit. So I like to take my white gel pen and just use that to touch up any areas that I may have gone out of the line. And I just quickly color over it. You can try to use a watercolor to clean it up, but I found just using my white gel pen works even easier, because with the water from the water pen, you just end up smearing the color anyway. All right, so before I make a mess out of these, I'm gonna set them aside and we're gonna start on our next step to our card. I have a stash of card bases that I have prepared. I keep these ready to go for whenever I'm card making. I'm just using some white cardstock. This is 110-pound Nita cardstock, and I already have these pre-cut and scored. They're at 4 1/4 by 11, scored at 5 1/2 to make for a top folding card. So I have those ready to go, though. So that was an easy little thing. I don't even have to do anything more with that. The next thing we need to do is some die cutting. I have another piece of the Bristol cardstock, which we're going to use Bristol because we're going to be using our Distress Oxide inks, and they blend nicely with the Bristol cardstock. So we're going to be using this. And then we're going to be using a die that I have in my stash for quite some time. This is the So Fancy die set from Mama Elephant, and this is one that has been around for quite a while. If it's still available, I will definitely link it below in the description, but I'm just going to use this one in the middle here that is the kind of like a half stitch side, and my Bristol. So we need to die cut 6 of these to go with our card, and I think if I'm lucky I am. I have a little piece of cardstock left over, so it's going to actually be just the perfect fit for this. So we're just going to go ahead and run this through the Big Shot, and we're going to need 6 of those. And while I have my Big Shot out, I went ahead and die cut all of my reindeer. Now I will say I did go ahead and heat set this with my heat gun just to make sure all of the ink was dry, the watercoloring was dry. So I'm just running that through. I kept my dies together. I could have cut them apart, but I was being lazy and just kept them connected. So I just have one more of these to die cut, and then we can go ahead and start doing a little bit of assembly. How adorable is that reindeer? Isn't he cute? So the next thing we're going to do is take some Antique Linen Distress Oxide ink, and I'm going to ink just a little background area onto these pieces of cardstock that we die cut with the Mama Elephant die. So we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to do a nice little light coat. And this is what I like about the Bristol cardstock. I'm terrible at blending on any kind of cardstock with the Distress inks. And I have tried the Distress Oxide inks onto just regular cardstock and I wasn't totally thrilled with it. And it's just me and my blending technique. I know if I kept working at it, I probably would be better at it. But I love it on the Bristol cardstock. It blends beautifully. So I'm just doing like just a little oval, messy background, something that I can put my reindeer on top of so that it has a nice little halo around it. It doesn't have to be totally perfect and it doesn't have to be center. It just needs to be a little bit of color that in the background. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on all of these pieces of cardstock that I cut out or die cut. And like I said, it's not going to be perfect. It's just going to be blendy mess. And, you know, I really don't care what it looks like. It's just a quick way to add a little bit of color onto the background of a stamped image and give it a little, so it's not floating in space kind of look. So we're going to go ahead and do all 6 of our pieces. So the next thing I want to do is just add a little bit more to this. What's nice about Distress Oxide inks, give it a little shot of water and it gives a nice little background effect. Again, you don't have to do this. This is something that I just wanted to do as an extra little step. But if you're in a hurry and you're looking to make some quick cards, skip this. So you can actually spray it and drop those little droplets onto your cardstock and let it sit for just a second or two and then dab it up with your paper toweling and it gives a really cool effect in the background. You can spray it directly if you want. I like the little bit of control I can get it when I spray it and drip it from my hands. We're going to go ahead and heat these with our heat gun just to dry them up and make sure the Distress Oxide is dry as well as those little droplets. The next thing we're going to do is stamp our sentiment. I'm using my Mini Misty, which is fantastic for card making. If you're a card maker or just getting into card making and you don't have a platform for stamping, I highly recommend this, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of masking techniques as well as what I'm doing, which is mass assembly of cards. So I'm going to take my cardstock that we die cut with the half stitch die, or however you want to say that little side piece there. And then I'm going to take my sentiment. Before I put my sentiment down, let's make sure we use our embossing buddy so that our sentiment only, or our embossing powder only sticks to the VersaMark and not to our cardstock. So I think that looks pretty straight to me. We're going to go ahead and close our door here. That's going to pick up our greeting. And then we're going to use our VersaMark to ink up our sentiment. My VersaMark pad is getting pretty dry, so it's time to use my refill on it. We're going to go ahead and stamp. And I have found when I am using a VersaMark and doing embossing that the more I let it sit and kind of soak into the paper and transfer from the stamp to the cardstock, the better impression and the better coverage I get with my embossing powder. So now what I'm going to do is just take the sentiment and I'm going to grab a piece of scrap paper here. And we're going to add our embossing powder. I'm just using a gold embossing powder from Ranger. And we're going to add our embossing powder. And I always like to give it more than one coat. We're going to go ahead and you may need to do a little cleanup sometimes. A little tweak of the cardstock will get rid of that stray embossing powder. And sometimes you need to pull out a little brush and clean it up that way. So now what we're going to do is take our heat gun and emboss our sentiment. So So now that I have one sentiment done, I can go ahead and keep doing the rest of them. So I'm just gonna pull back out my stamp, our Mini Mister. Mini Misty. Sorry, not Mini Mister. And then we're going to go ahead, we can put our cardstock right back inside, add our magnets to keep it in place, throw some embossing powder on there, and stamp and heat and stamp and emboss our sentiment. The next thing we need to do is pick out our pattern paper. I grabbed the Tim Holtz Christmas Ideology paper stash. It's an 8x8 paper pad, and I love the paper in here, so it's gonna be hard to decide. I could either do 6 different patterns, but I think what I'm gonna do is, since it's 8x8, I'm gonna cut this down to 4x5.5. So that's gonna give me a little border on each side of my card. So I picked out 3 colors, and I really love all of these. So we're going to cut these down to 4, which will be right in half of the size of our paper. And I was gonna try to do all 3 of them at one time, but I better not take those chances. So we have 4, and then we're gonna cut this to 5.5. And we're gonna do that for other pieces as well. So the last thing I'm doing is just putting my pattern paper onto my card bases. I cut these down to 4x5.5, so they need a little bit of, they'll have a little bit of white space on either side of our card. So I'm just starting at the top where my fold is, lining it up, and then adhering that down. So that gives me my 6 different card bases. So the next thing we're gonna do now that we have our card bases done is start adding our panel that has our sentiment. I was gonna go ahead and add some foam adhesive to this and pop this up, but since I'm going to be doing a foam adhesive on our reindeer, I decided just to adhere this directly down to the front of our card. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do all 6 of my panels. So I'm just adding some dimensional adhesive. This is just foam tape that I've had in my stash for quite some time to the back of my reindeer, and mounting that right onto the front of my card. So this was our first project in the Homemade for the Holiday series. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. The supplies I used for today's cards are down below in the YouTube description and over my blog, as well as some additional photos you'll find on my blog as well. So thanks everybody for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Bye!